She was 20 and homeless. No family anywhere, no savings, just a canvas saddlebag and $10 she had earned mending a halter for a rancher outside Eminence. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned saddlemaker's shop on a creek road in the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri, in a stretch of Shannon County that had not seen a working leather bench since the shop had closed in 1966. The log walls had gone silver with age. The porch had buckled. But what nobody knew was that hidden under the workbench of that old shop was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Darcy Slade had grown up with the smell of leather in her hands, not the clean department store smell of a new belt or a new purse, the deeper, richer, more complicated smell of working leather, the kind of leather that has been oiled and stitched and shaped over a wooden form and that carries in its fibers the specific warm animal scent of the hide it came from, and the neat's foot oil that preserved it, and the beeswax that sealed the thread. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize that smell the way certain grandmothers in certain mountain counties teach a child to recognize a thing that matters, by putting it in her hands and letting her hold it until the holding became knowing. Her grandmother's name was Ida Slade, and she had been a harness mender, a woman who repaired saddles, bridles, halters, reins, breast collars, and every other piece of leather tack used on the working horses and mules of Shannon County, Missouri, for 27 years. Ida had not worked in a shop. Ida had worked from her kitchen table, a heavy oak table that her husband, a man named Hollis Slade, had built in 1962 from timber he had cut on their 40-acre homestead in the hills above the Jacks Fork River. The table had been Ida's workbench from 1975 until 2002, and by the time Ida had stopped working, the surface of the oak was stained dark with neat's foot oil and scarred with the cuts of 1,000 knife strokes and polished smooth in the places where Ida's forearms had rested while she stitched. Ida had been born in 1938 in a log cabin on a ridge above the Jacks Fork, the daughter of a mule skinner named Earl Slade, who had logged timber in the Ozark Hills with a team of 4 mules from 1925 until 1968. 43 years of walking behind mules on steep mountain roads, hauling white oak and shortleaf pine down to the mill on the Current River. Earl had maintained his own harness. He had kept his mule's tack in working order the way a mechanic keeps an engine in order, not as a hobby, but as a condition of employment, because a mule with a broken harness was a mule that could not work, and a mule that could not work was a logger who could not eat. Earl had stitched leather by firelight in the cabin after supper, working a curved saddler's needle through the heavy harness leather with a stitching awl and waxed linen thread, and Ida had sat beside him on the cabin floor and watched his hands from the time she was old enough to sit. Earl had taught Ida to stitch at 8. He had given her a scrap of harness leather and a blunt needle and a length of waxed thread and had said, 2 needles, 1 thread. The thread goes through the hole from both sides at the same time. That's a saddle stitch. It's the strongest stitch there is because if one thread breaks, the other thread holds. A saddle stitch doesn't come apart. A machine stitch does. That's why I don't own a machine. Ida had learned the saddle stitch. She had learned it the way mountain children in the 1940s learned the trades their parents practiced, by doing it beside the person who knew, in the evening, by lamplight, with no book and no instruction beyond the words the person said and the motion the person's hands made. By 12, Ida could stitch a harness seam that Earl said was tighter than his own. By 16, she was doing most of the repair work on Earl's tack because Earl's hands had begun to stiffen with arthritis and the curved needle was harder for him to hold. Earl had died in 1968 when Ida was 30. Ida had continued mending harness, not for mules because the logging had shifted from mule teams to trucks by the late 1960s, but for the riding horses and trail horses and working ranch horses that were still common across Shannon County. The ranchers and trail outfitters of the Ozarks had brought their broken tack to Ida's kitchen table because the work was good and the price was fair, and the woman who did it understood in the specific way that a person who has grown up around working animals understands that a saddle was not a luxury. A saddle was the connection between a rider and a horse, and a broken saddle was a broken connection, and a broken connection could get someone hurt. Ida had also known about the old saddlemaker's shop. 3 miles down the creek road from the homestead, at a bend in the Jack's Fork, stood an abandoned log building that had been the workshop of a man named Orrin Tull, who had been the last working saddlemaker in Shannon County from 1920 until his death in 1966. Orrin had made saddles by hand, cutting the leather from hides he bought from the tannery in West Plains, shaping the pieces over wooden trees he carved himself from Ozark white oak, stitching the seams with the same saddle stitch Earl had used, the same stitch Ida had taught Darcy. Orrin's saddles had been famous in the county. They were heavy, plain, built for work rather than show, and they lasted. A rancher who bought an Orrin Tull saddle in 1940 was still riding it in 1966 when Orrin died, and the saddle was still sound. Orrin Tull could look at a horse and cut a saddle tree to fit it without measuring. Ida told Darcy once, on a winter evening when Darcy was 9, and Ida was showing her how to replace a stirrup leather. He could look at the horse's back, the width of the withers, the slope of the spine, the way the shoulder blades moved, and he could carve a tree from a block of white oak that would sit on that horse like it had grown there. That's not a skill you learn from a book. That's a skill you learn from looking at 1,000 horses. Ida had married Hollis Slade in 1960. Hollis had been a quiet man who had farmed the 40 acres in the hills above the Jack's Fork. Cattle, mostly, a small herd of about 30 head on steep, rocky pasture that was too rough for crops. Hollis had built the kitchen table and the cabin addition and the barn, and had never once suggested that Ida's leather work was anything less than essential, because Hollis had understood that the money Ida earned mending tack, never much, maybe $200 in a good month, was the difference between a household that could afford veterinary care for the cattle and a household that could not. Hollis had died in 1997. Ida had continued alone for 5 more years. Ida and Hollis had had one son, a man named Curtis who was Darcy's father. Curtis had left Shannon County at 18, had moved to Springfield, had worked construction, had gotten a woman pregnant, a woman named Tammy who was Darcy's mother, and had died of a methamphetamine overdose in a motel room in Branson when Darcy was 3. Tammy had tried to raise Darcy alone for 2 years after Curtis's death and had not been able to, because Tammy's own addiction had made the trying impossible, and Darcy had been placed in foster care at the age of 5. Darcy had not been placed with Ida. The state had determined that Ida, at 67, was too old to take custody of a 5-year-old. Darcy had been placed in a group home in West Plains, the Ozark Hills Children's Home, a state-licensed facility that housed 12 children between the ages of 5 and 18. Darcy had lived there for 13 years, from the age of 5 until the age of 18, when she had aged out of the system. The group home had not been cruel. It had been adequate. Darcy had been fed, clothed, schooled, and supervised by a rotating staff of adult caretakers who had done their best with 12 children and a budget that required the kind of efficiency that leaves no room for the specific patient attention a single child needs. Darcy had learned in the group home how to need less, how to take up less space, how to be second, not second to a biological child, but second to the system itself, which required meals at specific times and lights out at specific times and homework at specific times, and did not have a slot in the schedule for a girl who wanted to sit at a kitchen table and stitch leather by lamplight. The fixed point had been Ida. Every other Saturday, a state-approved visit, a caseworker drove Darcy from West Plains to the homestead in the hills above the Jack's Fork, 3 hours round trip, and Darcy sat at the kitchen table with Ida and stitched. Not for the full day. The visits were 4 hours, and the caseworker sat in the car and waited, and the 4 hours were the most important 4 hours of Darcy's life because the 4 hours were the hours in which she was not a foster child in a group home, but a granddaughter at a kitchen table learning the trade. Ida had taught Darcy to cut leather at 7. to hold the round knife with her thumb on the spine of the blade and draw it toward her body in a single, smooth stroke, letting the weight of the knife do the cutting, never pushing, never sawing. "The leather knows where it wants to be cut," Ida said. "Your job is to follow the line the leather is already showing you." Ida had also taught Darcy to read leather, not just to cut it and stitch it, but to look at a piece of leather and understand what it was. Where it came from on the hide, how it had been tanned, how thick it was, how much stretch it had, whether it would hold a crease or spring back. The shoulder of the hide was dense and stiff, good for saddle trees and stirrup leathers, the parts that bore weight. The belly was thinner and more flexible, good for skirts and fenders, the parts that needed to move with the horse. The back was the strongest part, tight-grained and even good for anything that had to last. Ida had taught Darcy to feel the grain by running her fingers across the surface, and Darcy had learned, by the age of 10, to tell which part of the hide a piece of leather had come from without looking at the stamp, just by the feel of the grain under her fingertips. The visits had been, for Darcy, the architecture of her childhood. The group home was Monday through Friday. Institutional time, scheduled time, time that belonged to the system. Saturday, every other Saturday, was Ida's table. Specific time, focused time, time that belonged to the work. The contrast had shaped Darcy by teaching her that there were two kinds of time, and that the kind that mattered was the kind that had a purpose. By 9, Darcy could cut a straight line through 4-ounce saddle leather without a ruler. By 11, she could stitch a saddle seam at 10 stitches per inch, the professional standard for working tack. By 14, Ida had let her repair a bridle for a rancher named Mr. Jessup, who had driven up the Ridge Road with a head stall whose cheek piece had torn at the buckle. Darcy had cut a new cheek piece from a scrap of harness leather, stitched it to the crown with a double saddle stitch, and riveted the buckle in place. Mr. Jessup had turned the bridle in his hands and said, "Who did this work?" Ida said, "My granddaughter." Mr. Jessup said, "Tell her she stitches like her grandmother." Ida said, "I just did." Ida had died when Darcy was 16. A heart attack at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in January, the morning of one of Darcy's visits. The caseworker had driven up the Ridge Road and had found the door unlocked and the fire burning in the wood stove, and Ida sitting at the table with a half-finished stirrup leather in her lap, and the curved needle still threaded with waxed linen. Darcy had arrived 20 minutes later. She had sat down at the table across from Ida and had picked up the stirrup leather and had finished the seam. The caseworker had not stopped her. The caseworker had understood. Darcy had taken the round knife, the stitching awl, the curved needles, and a spool of waxed linen thread. She had taken the oak kitchen table, too. Or she had tried, but the table would not fit in the caseworker's car, and there was no room for it at the group home, and the table had stayed in the cabin. After Ida's death, Darcy had spent 2 more years at the group home. She had aged out at 18, packed a canvas saddlebag with her clothes and Ida's tools, and walked out the front door of the Ozark Hills Children's Home on a Tuesday morning in March, with $180 in her pocket and no family anywhere. She had moved to Eminence, the nearest town to the homestead where Ida had lived, because Eminence was on the Jack's Fork River, and the Jack's Fork was the closest thing to home Darcy had. She had rented a room above a hardware store for $300 a month, and had gotten a job at a trail riding outfitter on the river, grooming horses and cleaning tack for $11 an hour. The outfitter, a man named Roy Tillett, had noticed within Darcy's first week that she handled leather differently from the other stable hands. "You don't just clean the tack," Roy said one afternoon watching Darcy oil a saddle. "You check every stitch, every rivet, every buckle. Nobody taught you to do that here." "Where'd you learn?" Darcy said, "My grandmother." Roy said, "She teach you to stitch too?" Darcy said, "Yes, sir." Roy had handed her a broken breast collar that had been sitting in the tack room for 6 months. "Fix that? If it holds, I'll pay you mender's rate." Darcy had fixed it. It held. Roy had paid her $40 for the repair, and started sending her every broken piece of tack from his stable of 23 horses. The room above the hardware store had lasted 2 years. It had ended in the spring of Darcy's 20th year when the outfitter cut her hours. The trail season had been slow, the river was too high for crossings, and Roy could not afford full-time stable help until the summer bookings picked up. Without full-time hours, Darcy could not cover the rent. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever held a tool that belonged to someone who died and felt in the holding that the person was still teaching you? She had $10 in her pocket and no car. She had Ida's tools in the saddlebag. She was standing at the counter of the Eminence feed store the following Monday, buying a bag of horse treats for Roy's stable with her own money, because the horses knew her and she could not stop coming even when she was not being paid, when she overheard 2 ranchers in the back of the store. They were talking about old buildings. One of them mentioned a saddlemaker's shop on the Creek Road, a log building that had been on the county surplus list for years. "Nobody wants it," the rancher said. "Too far off the road, no electric, no water. County's asking $10. The other rancher said, "That's old Orrin Tull's place. My daddy bought his first saddle from Orrin in 1949. Still have it in the barn. Still sound." The first rancher said, "Everything Orrin made was sound." Darcy had turned around. "Where is that shop?" The rancher looked at her. He was in his 70s, in a canvas coat and a sweat-stained hat. "Creek Road, about 3 miles past the bridge, log building on the left set back from the road. You'll know it by the porch. It's buckled, but the ridgepole's straight." He paused. "You interested?" "Yes, sir," Darcy said. She walked to the Shannon County Clerk's office in Eminence that afternoon. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Holt, stamped the deed and handed Darcy an iron key on a leather thong. "Orrin Tull's key," Mrs. Holt said. "He brought it to this office the day he knew he was dying and set it on the counter and said, 'Somebody will want this.' That was 1966. She looked at Darcy. "Took 58 years, but here you are." She walked the Creek Road that evening. The shop stood at the bend in the Jack's Fork exactly as Ida had described it, a log building with a stone chimney, a buckled porch, and a heavy plank door. She put the key in the lock. It turned. One room. Log walls chinked with lime mortar, a puncheon floor, heavy timber beams, a stone fireplace with a forge alcove built into the side. Along the south wall, a massive wooden workbench, 8 feet long, 3 feet deep, built from hand-hewn oak, with a leather-working vise bolted to one end and a row of wooden drawers beneath. The bench surface was stained dark with decades of neat's foot oil and scarred with knife cuts. The same way Ida's kitchen table had been stained because a leather worker's bench and a leather worker's table tell the same story in the same language. She ran her hand along the bench surface. It was smooth and warm to the touch. The oil in the wood had preserved it. She knelt and looked under the bench. The drawers on the front were empty. But at the back, against the wall, a section of the puncheon floor was different. One board was shorter than the others and sat slightly higher, and the ends had been beveled, which was the kind of detail a craftsman would do. She pried the board up with Ida's awl. Beneath it, in a shallow stone-lined cavity in the earth, wrapped in oilcloth, were a leather tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch, and a thick leather-bound book. The tool roll held a matched set of Saddlemaker's hand tools, a round knife with a hand-forged blade, a stitching groover for cutting thread channels, a set of 6 pricking irons for marking stitch holes, an edge beveler for finishing cut edges, and a bone folder for creasing and burnishing. Each tool handle was stamped O.T., Orrin Tool. The round knife was the twin of Ida's round knife, which had been Earl's before it was Ida's. Same shape, same weight, same curve to the blade. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 34 Liberty Quarter Eagles, dated between 1920 and 1965. The coin dealer in West Plains valued them at approximately $21,000. The book was a pattern book, page after page of hand-drawn templates on heavy paper, each one showing the flat pattern for a specific piece of saddlery: the seat, the skirt, the jockey, the fender, the stirrup leather, the cinch strap, the breast collar, the head stall, the reins. 41 patterns in all, each one measured and marked with stitching lines and rivet points, each one refined across decades of making saddles for the working horsemen of the Ozarks. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded letter. To whoever finds these tools, my name is Orrin Tall. I have made saddles in this shop from 1920 until today, the 2nd of November, 1966. I am dying, and I will not come back. I am putting my tools and my patterns and my savings under the bench because the bench is the heart of the shop, and the tools belong near the heart. The round knife is the most important tool. It is the first thing a saddlemaker picks up in the morning and the last thing he sets down at night. The patterns are the work of 46 years. They are every saddle I ever made, drawn flat, ready to be cut again. The gold is what I saved. Use it for the shop, cut some leather, stitch something. Orrin Tall, Saddlemaker, November 2nd, 1966. Darcy read the letter twice. Then she picked up Orrin's round knife from the tool roll and held it in her right hand, the way Ida had taught her. Thumb on the spine, fingers wrapped around the handle, the blade curving away from her body. She found a scrap of dried leather on the bench, a piece of 4-ounce saddle leather stiff with age, and she drew the blade across it in a single, smooth stroke. The leather opened along the line of the cut, clean and straight, the edge smooth, no tearing, no fraying. One cut. She held the scrap up and looked at the cut edge in the pale evening light from the window, and did not cry and did not speak. She simply looked at the line where the blade had gone, clean as a sentence. She said quietly to the bench and the log walls and the stone chimney, "Thank you, Mr. Tall. I know the line." The next morning, she walked to town and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on the square in Eminence. She opened a checking account and walked out into the spring light. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 1997 Ford F-150 with 196,000 miles and a bed full of hay dust, from a retired rancher in Ellington for $1,500. The first month was the chimney. The flue was blocked with 58 years of mud dauber nests and fallen mortar, and the fireplace could not draw until the flue was clear. Darcy borrowed a chimney brush from Roy Tillett and climbed the roof and worked the brush down from the top, the dried mud and mortar falling into the hearth in chunks. Roy came out to the shop on a Saturday in his truck to help her repoint the chimney cap with fresh mortar, a 5-gallon bucket of lime mortar Roy had mixed in his barn. "Orrin Tall made my daddy's first saddle," Roy said, troweling mortar into the capstones. "My daddy said Orrin's hands were the steadiest hands in Shannon County. Sounds like your grandmother's were the second steadiest." Darcy said, "She'd argue with you about the order." She made the shop livable in pieces. She bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in West Plains for $12 and set it against the east wall near the window that faced the creek, so she could lie in the dark and hear the Jack's Fork running over the rocks below the bend. She found a small cast-iron wood stove at a yard sale in Birch Tree for $30, a potbelly stove, squat and blackened and heavy as a millstone, and Roy helped her carry it in through the porch door and set it on a flat stone in the corner. She bought a length of stovepipe from the hardware store in Eminence and ran it through a hole she chiseled in the log wall, stuffing the gap with clay from the creek bank the way Ozark settlers had chinked their cabin walls for 200 years. The first fire she lit, dry oak splits from a fallen tree behind the shop, filled the room with the dry, warm smell of burning hardwood, and the warmth traveled through the log walls and the puncheon floor and settled into the massive workbench, and the neat's foot oil in the bench wood warmed, too, and released its scent, and the room smelled for the first time in 58 years the way a working saddlemaker's shop smells. smoke and oil and leather and beeswax. Darcy sat on the cot and watched the firelight move across the bench and the log walls and the stone chimney and thought, this is what Orrin Tull smelled every morning for 46 years. This is what Ida smelled at the kitchen table. This is the smell of the trade. She set Ida's tools on the workbench beside Orrin's tools. The two round knives side by side, Ida's darker and thinner from 27 years of use, Orrin's lighter and thicker, preserved under the floorboard. She hung the pattern book from an iron nail above the bench, open to the saddle seat pattern, the most complex pattern in the book, with 23 individual pieces. She set Ida's curved needles in the drawer beside Orrin's pricking irons, and she placed a photograph of Ida at the kitchen table. Ida in 1989, round knife in her hand, a half-finished saddle skirt on the table in front of her, on the shelf above the cot. A woman named Mrs. Chilton, who ran the general store in Eminence, heard from Mrs. Holt at the clerk's office that a girl had bought the tool shop and was living in it. Mrs. Chilton drove out to the Creek Road on a Sunday afternoon with a box of groceries: flour, lard, beans, coffee, a jar of blackberry preserves she had put up herself, and said, "Ida Slade was your grandmother." Darcy said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Chilton said, "Ida mended my mother's side saddle in 1984. My mother said Ida's stitching was as fine as anything Orrin Tull ever did. She came back every Sunday after that. She always brought something. She never stayed long." Word spread along the Creek Road and into town. Roy started sending his trail riders to Darcy when their tack needed more than a cleaning: a cracked saddle tree, a torn skirt, a broken cinch ring. A rancher from Summersville drove an hour with a 100-year-old saddle that had belonged to his grandfather and that had a ripped cantle binding. Darcy repaired it on the workbench using Orrin's edge beveler and Ida's waxed linen thread, and the rancher held the saddle up to the window light and turned it and said, "I can't tell where the old leather ends and the new leather begins." Darcy said, "That's the idea." He told his neighbors. 2 more saddles came in that month. She got a job in her second year. A custom saddle shop in Mountain View hired her 3 days a week, because the owner, a man named Mr. Vickers, had heard from Roy that there was a young woman at the old tool place who could stitch 10 stitches per inch by hand and who owned Orrin Tull's original pattern book. Mr. Vickers had driven to the Creek Road and had watched Darcy cut a saddle fender from a side of leather using Orrin's round knife, the blade moving through the leather in a single continuous curve without lifting, and he had said, "Nobody cuts freehand anymore. Everybody uses a template and a rotary cutter." Darcy said, "Orrin cut freehand. My grandmother cut freehand. The leather shows you the line." Mr. Vickers said, "I've been making saddles for 30 years and I've never seen a cut that clean. Start Monday." On a clear evening in late October of her 23rd year, Darcy sat on the buckled porch of the shop and watched the last copper light fade across the Jack's Fork. The river ran clear over the rocks at the bend below, the water catching the sunset in long gold streaks. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight in the still autumn air. Inside the shop, the workbench glowed in the firelight, the 2 round knives side by side on its surface, and the pattern book hung open above them, and the smell of neatsfoot oil and wood smoke filled the room, the way it had filled it when Orrin Tull had worked here and the way it filled it now. She thought about Orrin, who had stood at that bench for 46 years, cutting leather freehand and stitching saddles that lasted a lifetime. She thought about Earl, who had stitched harness by firelight in a log cabin after a day of walking behind mules. And she thought about Ida, who had sat at a kitchen table for 27 years mending the broken connections between riders and horses, and who had taught a girl in a group home, 4 hours at a time, every other Saturday, the one trade that the schedule could not take away. That's the thing about the stitches our grandmothers teach us. We do not always know, when we are 7 years old and pushing a curved needle through a scrap of leather at a kitchen table, that the stitching is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, visit by visit, stitch by stitch. And then, 4 years after the old woman dies, we pry up a floorboard in a shop she told us about and find the tools of the man whose saddles she spent her life repairing. And we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that a saddle stitch does not come apart. She had been teaching us that 2 threads going through the same hole from opposite sides make a bond that holds. Darcy Slade was 20 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned saddlemaker's shop on a creek road in the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. There's also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet Road.